Hello, everyone, and welcome to another round of Question and Perspective. I hope that you're having a good afternoon, and thanks for joining me across platforms. I am live on TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, and Substack. So thanks for watching wherever you are. Sorry if you're on TikTok, I have to use a different device to stream on TikTok because TikTok will only allow you to stream if most of your content is through video games, which obviously mine is not. So, the way this works is if you have a question, something that you've been wondering about, I invite you to place that in the comment section and I will give you my perspective on that question. In progressive Christianity, we don't always think that there is a single right answer. Instead, we think there are multiple perspectives, and that's one of the beauties of progressive Christianity is recognizing that that you can have multiple perspectives and there isn't necessarily one right answer. So anyway, I am thinking today about evolution. That's we do a weekly series for the Center for Progressive Christianity, and it's called Ask a Progressive Christian. And on Ask a Progressive Christian this week, I was talking about if Christians can believe in evolution, and the argument I made was, of course, Christians can believe in evolution, and not only that, Christians should believe in evolution because all evidence points to that. And here's one of the biggest issues I think we have in uh, in in Christianity in general is that we think that in order to be a Christian, what we really need to do is to eschew all scientific fact. We have to eschew reason, and instead, what we need to embrace is just myth or what we've been taught, or we have to check our brains at the door. And I don't think real Christianity is about that. You know, Jesus told us to love our God with our heart, our strength, and our mind. And I think that's something that people forget. In fact, he's quoting the Hebrew Bible there, but he adds love God with all our mind. And so what that means I think is that in the 21st century we recognize that the sciences and social sciences are a real gift and they help us to understand how God is actually at work in the world, because if we believe that God is at work in the world, then shouldn't we want to know how God actually God works in the world? So inquiring truth says none of this is relevant to Christianity. Can you back this up? Well, I mean, I think if you actually believe that God is at work in the world, then don't you want to know what actually happened? And in my video this week, I quoted a professor in college. I took this class called The Quest for the Historical Jesus, and he went around and he asked everyone if they believed in unicorns and asked them to write it down on a sheet of paper. And then he collected all of that up. And he said, oh, okay, nobody believes in unicorns. And then he said, okay, but in the King James Version of the Bible, there are unicorns, because in the King James Version of the Bible, there's a translation decision where they decided to translate an animal as unicorn. And then subsequent translations translated that as oxen. And so then he said, okay, now how many of you believe in unicorns? Write it down. And so again, people wrote down on a sheet of paper, they passed them in, and all of a sudden, people believed in unicorns, not because there was any evidence for that, not because there was any proof that unicorns had actually ever existed on this earth, but because they found out that it was in a single translation of the Bible because of a translation decision. And so this is the problem with the way that a lot of Christians look at things. They're not really interested on fact, they're simply interested on theological interpretation. So on Instagram, it's Langston28 says, why did God direct Moses to take the slaves out of Egypt, yet let black people suffer for 200 years? And so, obviously, through slave trade, and of course, people of color continue to suffer and have been marginalized throughout history. Here's the thing that I think is really important to know about the Exodus story, that it has been essential for liberation theologians. And so these are theologians who think about how it is that God liberates people throughout history, how the story of God is the story of freedom and liberation and living more into who God wants us to be, thriving humans. And the story of God liberating people from Egypt is a powerful story for liberation theology. But here's something that I think is important to note, and that's that archaeologists can't find any proof that this actually ever historically happened. And this gets back to the point that I was raising just a few moments ago. We want to know what actually happened in history because if we believe God's at work in our world, that shows us how God actually does things. But what archaeologists have found is not any evidence of a mass exodus. Seas don't just randomly split. And there have been people who have tried to justify that scientifically. But look, folks, that's stretching. You have to do all kinds of mental gymnastics for that. Seas don't just magically split. Manna doesn't just magically rain down from the sky. And on top of that, uh, Egyptians were really good record keepers. They would have noted if an entire people just went across the border, and they didn't. It didn't happen. But what archaeologists have discovered is that in the hill country of the Northern Kingdom, because later on the kingdom would split into two. The kingdom of Israel would split into two, and so in that northern hill country, they have found artifacts from Egypt that came over the course of several centuries. So, what that means is that likely there is truth to people coming out of Egypt, but it didn't happen in one grand narrative. It happened gradually over the centuries. And I think that that is a story that gives us hope about how liberation often actually happens. We want it to happen in one grand narrative. We often tell it as if it is happening in one grand narrative. But the truth is, the way that it often happens is little by little, one victory at a time. And that's, I think, something that's helpful whenever we are going through struggles in our lives, whether those are struggles that are personal, whether it is stories that are about systemic injustice, that they are stories that help us to know that even if things don't get fixed right away, that God is on the side of the liberation of God's people. And for me, that gives us hope. So back on Instagram, uh, James and thy says Moses stories are folk myth etiology for Hebrew origins. We've moved on from that. Well, I mean, yeah, I mean, I think it is a story. There's debate amongst scholars too. Like was Moses based on a real person or not? And there's some thought that there was some great leader like that, but yeah, we really don't know. But I don't think we just move on. And this is one of the things that I think is so important is that there is a distinction between fact and truth, right? That we need to know fact. We need to know, like, did this actually happen in one grand narrative? And as I've said, I've already argued that I don't think it did, that it happened over time. But that doesn't mean that the story isn't true, because it is a true story that God desires liberation of God's people, that God is at work in the world through people. And that, I think, for me, is something that is very inspiring. So why does God allow then people to continue to suffer, especially people of color to continue to suffer? Well, I don't think God is allowing that. Human beings are allowing that. And if we if we want to talk about this in terms of sin, then for me that's one of the clearest examples of how sin actually is in the world. How is sin in the world? Well, sin is in the world because human beings allow it to be. And God calls us to follow the teachings of Jesus and to then work for a more just society, to work for a place in which peace and justice reign. So this is also on Instagram. It says, "Are you a feminist?" This is real Harriet underscore. Yes, I think you can't follow Jesus without being a feminist, and I think wanting equality for women, wanting women to be recognized as full human beings, because this is one of the problems, right? We don't often treat women as full human beings, that women continue to be marginalized. We're in 2026 and we continue to have discussions about whether women can be in leadership in the church and all kinds of ridiculous things, particularly whenever we think about how Jesus acted. So, Jesus, we often talk about Jesus in terms of having 12 male followers, but Jesus had all kinds of followers, many of whom were women. And in the Gospel of Luke, we discover that women funded Jesus's ministry. And we also often talk about how Jesus was abandoned at the cross through his trial and at the cross, but that's not really true. The women were with him every step of the way. They were with him through the trial. They were there at the foot of the cross. They are the ones who went to anoint the body and found Jesus. And as Jurgen Moltmann has said, without women preachers, we would have no knowledge of the resurrection. Women were faithful, and so and continue to be. And so it is incredibly ridiculous that here we are in 2026, and churches in particular, but society at large as well, continue to have discussions about what the role of women ought to be. And we ought to find that uh, just disgusting. Um, what's your opinion? This is from Papaya. What's your opinion on America's current administration? Would you say they are anti Christian? Yeah, not a fan of America's current administration. And are they anti Christian? Yes, they are anti Christ. So a lot of times people think that anti Christ means a single person. Like, again, we transform this into a grand narrative where there's one antichrist who's going to bring about the end of the world. But you know what? In the Bible, the way that we often hear that talked about is being antichrist, like against the teachings of Jesus. And I don't think you can look at the actions of this administration and argue that they are consistent with the teachings of Jesus. I don't think even people who support the administration and try to claim their faith can really say that they are acting in any way that is compatible with the teachings of Jesus Christ. I mean, Jesus told us to welcome the stranger. He told us to feed the hungry. He told us to care for those in need, to take care of the sick. And we're not doing any of those things. So definitely, Trump administration, antichrist. Christy, this is also on or this is on TikTok. Says many of your Instagram videos, you're wearing vestments. Videos of you preaching or in a suit. Why? Well, I often switch it up, and one of the reasons that on social media I typically will wear like a robe and stole is because I say things that a lot of religious leaders don't say, and things that people I think have been longing to hear, or a lot of people have been longing to hear the church say. And so whenever I'm on social media, a lot of times I will wear a robe and stole so that I'm immediately recognized as a clergy person, so that people will say, whoa, that's not what I expect a clergy person to be saying, because Christian nationalism and Christian fundamentalism have so hijacked Christianity in the United States that people think that's what Christianity is, even though the things that they advocate are anti-Christ. On Sunday mornings, I often don't wear a robe and stoles because it's obvious what I'm doing there. And honestly, it's hard to turn the microphone on and off with with a robe on. And so, if you go into churches, you'll see people wearing a variety of things. Sometimes they'll wear like this white robe with a rope, and that's called an alb and cincture, and that is kind of similar to first century dress in the Roman Empire, similar to what Jesus would have worn. Sometimes you'll see people wear something on top of that called the chasuble, that's kind of like an ancient coat and has different colors for the liturgical season. Sometimes you'll go in, you'll see people wearing a cassock, which is kind of like a tighter robe that represents kind of a later type of dress. And then in my tradition, we often wear an academic gown. And that's because in the Reformed tradition, in which I find myself, there's always been an emphasis on education. And I hope that's something that you can see in my videos, an emphasis on bringing education to to faith. And it's also because John Calvin wasn't ordained, and so he was a lawyer and wore his academic gown. And then the stoles represent ordination. So that is why I wear them on Instagram, but or not, or on TikTok or whatever on social media, but not always whenever I'm preaching in worship. Let's see. On back on Instagram here. The problem of suffering is the greatest argument against theism. This is from Colorado Monkey. You eventually have to come up with your own theodicy for slavery, cancer, child murder, and all else. And that's right. I mean, theodicy, the understanding of evil, study of evil, is something that there isn't a great answer to, right? And people struggle with that. There, as Colorado Monkey has said, there's a whole field of theology dedicated to trying to figure out why it is that we suffer, and it's really, really hard. But for me, the answer that makes sense for me is exactly what I shared earlier, that God doesn't cause humanity to suffer, but human beings cause humanity to suffer. And a lot of times, one of the things that I will hear from people is that that we why is it that God allows this, or this isn't compatible with the theology that I learned? How can I make sense of all this? And whenever I hear that from people, one of the things I often ask them is, how do you understand God? Because a lot of times it's our understanding of God that leads to a theodicy that doesn't make sense. So if we think that God is all powerful and all knowing, then how can God allow suffering? And so often where I start with this whole thought is asking people to maybe rethink the way that they view God. Because if we don't view God in that way, then our theology can adapt. So for me, I tend to view God as the source of love and connection between us all, and not a being in the sky pulling all the strings. And if you see God in that way, if you see God as a source of connection, as a source of love that that goes through us all, then that is something that lends a more gracious understanding for how it is that there is suffering in the world and how it is that we can respond. So back to TikTok here. Catholic Sam says, "Are you pro-life?" And obviously, I've been pretty vocal about this issue. I posted a couple of videos about this week when I was at the March for Life Pro Life Summit, a place I never thought I would be. And so I am pro reproductive health, and I don't think that the way that we typically talk about this as pro life and pro choice are helpful distinctions, because people who claim to be pro life don't seem all that pro life to me. I mean, I don't think you can claim to be pro life while not supporting the fetus after it has been born. As a child grows up, if we're not providing safety nets, if we are not ensuring that those children are well taken care of, if we're not working for a more just economic system, if we're not providing healthcare, then we're not really pro-life. As so many have said, we're just pro-birth. And the Bible itself doesn't define life as beginning at conception, no matter how badly some 21st century Americans want it to. The Bible defines life as beginning later than we typically think about it today, not earlier. And the verses that people use to try to justify life beginning at conception are just verses ripped wildly out of context. Take Psalm 139, for example, where it says, "You formed me and know me, you knit me together in my mother's womb." Well, that is poetry. Psalms are literally poetry and song. And in that psalm, the psalmist is clearly using metaphorical language as he's talking about how God has been with him throughout his life, even before birth, throughout life, even after death, in the morning until the evening, to the very edges of the earth, the text says. And so it's about intimacy with God. Same with the call stories that people often point to. Jeremiah is a popular one where God calls Jeremiah in utero. But look, that is a way of saying that a person's life is going to be special. It's a typical literary device in the ancient world, even in some modern tellings, to talk about God placing a call on your life. There are some places in the biblical text where God places a call on someone's life before conception. I mean, if we're going to extend that same kind of theology, that same kind of thought process, then we would have to believe that God called people before they were born. So, are we going to define life as beginning before conception? Well, that's ludicrous. None of that makes any sense. So, in Genesis chapter 2, verse 7, we see that God creates Adam, which is Hebrew for humanity, and humanity then takes a breath and becomes alive. And I think that's a decent point for how we define life in the 21st century as well. I think that oddly converges with modern science that pretty much around the time a fetus could survive by itself, viability outside the womb, that's a pretty good marker of when life actually begins. And so the just to carry this further, the Bible doesn't even define life as there for a fetus. That in in Exodus 21, there's a story about a fight in which the fight causes an accidental miscarriage, and the fetus that is miscarried is treated as a property loss. Whereas it says if the woman were to die, that would be a murder. So the Bible just does not understand things in the same way that we do in the 21st century. They don't have a modern scientific understanding. They didn't have a modern scientific understanding. And that's okay. We don't need them to have a modern scientific understanding. We just need to know that that they understood it in a very, very different way. So uh, I am someone who believes in reproductive health. I think that is faithful. I think it is a good way to care for people, and I think it is compassionate. Okay, let's go ahead and continue placing comments in the comment section wherever you are watching. I'm live on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and Substack and YouTube, and I appreciate all of you. So I want to go to Facebook. Haven't been there yet. This is from Stephanie Enos. Sorry if I'm mispronouncing your last name there. Who's a psych NP and has had a few patients talk about having a lot of religious trauma. Do you have a recommendation on a resource for helping them in healing from that religious trauma? So this is unfortunately something that happens all the time. That churches frequently do not do a good job of living into who they're supposed to be. And that can happen in all kinds of ways. But one of the ways that it frequently happens is that churches, religious communities deny people's very being. So I'm thinking particularly about things like churches denying someone's sexual orientation or gender identity, or telling them that they are inherently sinful just because of who they are. Let me just say right here that that is bad theology, that you are exactly who God created you to be, that you are loved, that you are valued, that regardless of your sexual orientation or gender identity, you are a reflection of God's divine image. And so I think there are a number of ways that people can heal from that or find some healing in the midst of that. One is to immediately remove oneself from a toxic situation like that. That can be so hard because faith is such an important part of so many of our lives. But to get out of that system of toxicity, often it requires a period of recuperation, a time away, and it may take therapy and working with someone who specializes in religious trauma, which I mean obviously isn't me. I'm just a pastor here, but people who specialize in that kind of work can be so valuable. And then reading, often doing some deconstruction. There are a lot of great resources out there from folks. I post a lot of them on my page. If people send me materials and I have time to go through and read them, a lot of times I will go and recommend those. And I also think that reading some classics like, say, Marcus Borg's Meeting Jesus Again for the First Time can be incredibly healing. And then if people are ready, finding some kind of spiritual nurturing that works for them. And so over and over again, as we see these Pew Religious Landscape studies that show that people are leaving the church, it just shows that people are tired of organized religion getting it wrong. They're not tired of spirituality. They're not tired of seeking justice. They're not tired of asking the big questions. They're tired of people who can't do those things, who won't live into the call. And so finding some way to nurture your spiritual life, whether that is uh, running or hiking or playing sports or being in a softball league, or if it's being in a religious community where you feel safe, all of that is good. And so find what it is that nourishes your soul. This is back to Instagram. This is from Moose Fanta. Do you believe that the idea of heaven is how you imagine it to be based on your perspective and and things that make you happy, or is it a set plane or existence where everyone is regardless of religion? So I have no idea about an afterlife or what it's like, and I often will quote Marcus Borg, who I just recommended reading his book Meeting Jesus Again for the First Time, and he says this. He says, "Is there an afterlife, and if so, what will it be like? I don't have a clue." But I have faith that the God who buoyed us in life will buoy us in death. What more that means, I do not know, but it's all I need to know. And for me, that works. That ultimately, whatever happens after this life, if there is something after this life, it's out of our control anyway. And so why worry about that? I don't know what that looks like. What I do know is how Jesus taught us to live in the here and now. And if, as Christians, we believe that Jesus is the clearest example we have of God, if the best teacher about God, and I believe that as a Christian, that Jesus is one of many spirit people and is the one who teaches me the most about God, then by following Jesus's teachings, that's the best I can do anyway. So, what more that means, I don't know. But for me, that's all that I need to know. That by following Jesus, I am doing the absolute best I can to try and follow God as I know God and understand God. Well, friends, it's been about half an hour, and I appreciate you joining me for Question and Perspective. It had been a little while since I did this. I did one last week, and I'm going to try to do these a little more regularly. I'll try to maybe do them at a specified time rather than at a random time whenever I feel like it during the week. But thank you for joining me today. I appreciate it. It's good to see you, and thanks to all of you for following. Appreciate it.